What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy the
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101, the place where we hear live and direct from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. I'm Jeff Browning, and we're grateful to you for being here. Today we're excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Jared Holt, who works at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Before this, Jared was an investigative reporter at Right Wing Watch, and his work has appeared in Washington Post, Huffington Post, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He's a leading expert on homegrown terrorism in the United States, on the things that lead people to commit actual acts of violence against others, call for violence against specific groups, or even try to end the American experiment itself. Since the 1700s, our nation's productivity, standard of living, and place in the world have really grown in incredible ways. And all of it comes from a culture of ideas that's fiercely pro-free thought, pro-expression, and pro-individualism. Our right to protest the government here is protected by the same government we're criticizing. Even though we disagree with each other, our elections lead to new leaders and new ideas. In our history, the country has experienced and withstood attacks against ships, against buildings, and more recently, against the same constitutional order that's gotten us this far. The events of January 6th, how we got here, and what it means now are burned into the history of this country just as other terrorist attacks were, external and internal. And at this critical juncture, as we look to understand the course of violent radicalization in America, what it looks like, and what its impacts could be, we were grateful to hear from Jared, who's one of the nation's leading experts on all of this, for a real conversation about how people radicalize, what forces support that, where our national security policy has fallen short in protecting us from radicalization, and what it all means. It was a great conversation with great audience questions. The podcaster Eric Weinstein spontaneously dropped by to offer some thoughts. Again, our live format is awesome. If you haven't checked it out, I strongly suggest you do. If you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, hear past episodes, or just send us an angry message, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
But I'm wondering if you could take us through what's the actual process of monitoring extremist activity online? Like, where do you go and what do you read on a day-to-day basis? Does it require membership on strange message boards? And do you ever get worried about that?
It's a big mix of stuff. At risk of accidentally sending more people to some of these terrible websites, I'll abstain from naming them, but there's collections of blogs, forum boards, alternative platform, mainstream platform. Essentially, the way I do my work has been to, put myself in the shoes of the most terminally online version of a right-wing extremist and just consume all the content that's popular in their circles. I obviously can't get to all of it, and that's, a limitation as a researcher, of course. But within that scope, I try to triage things to, really prioritize movements that have histories of violence or have influence in broader political circles.
So I kind of want to get into that. You said you try and get into the terminally furthest of the right-wing extremism. What effect does that kind of work have on you? With so much exposure to these arguments, not to be uncouth or kind of harsh here, do you ever start questioning reality, though, or even finding some of these talking points convincing? Because reading this stuff all day, it has to take.
Well, I mean, I think where people get tripped up is, like, for example, the best conspiracy theories out there are built on top of grains of truth. They take these grains of truth and they spin them, they mischaracterize them, they subtract context. There's a variety of ways they do this to, essentially pervert what the reality of any given situation is. But I think kind of just acknowledging that along the way there are occasionally you will find these grains of truth is important, so that you don't feel like you're crazy when you do so. As far as like the toll it has on myself, at this point I've been doing this long enough that I'm able to, weather it pretty well. But I will, to be perfectly frank and honest, like when I first started doing this work, like there were, weeks sometimes where I didn't know how to cope. And every once in a while, I still like get that hopeless feeling if there's a big, mass shooting or something. I remember after Christchurch happened in 2019, just having a week where I felt like I was just going to vomit all the time. And it's, it's just part of the territory. This kind of work isn't for everybody. It's like, it can be very tedious, and you're really just, consuming and sorting and analyzing like the worst of society and hopes of trying to inform ways people can do things about it, or minimize the harms, or especially minimize the violence that comes out of, these really hateful ideologies. And, I guess it's just that mission focus and that, in a sense of moral clarity that I have, that keeps me going forward.
What do you like? Meditate, exercise? Is there something that you do to unplug? Because it has to be hard, and I'm sure everybody could take some good advice if you have any tricks.
I have creative outlets. I've played guitar since I was like 12. So I'm not too bad at it, I guess, at this point in my life. So I play a lot of guitar. When it's nice outside, I do cycling, and really just try to take that energy that builds up, not to sound too like woo-woo spiritual guru, but like to take all that negative energy that builds up and try to get it out of my system in ways that, like through music, are creative and bring joy, or through things like exercise, which can leave you feeling really cleansed and, energized afterward.
That's awesome. I try and exercise to kind of deprogram from cable news or social media. Now I kind of want to turn the conversation and get into these extremists themselves. What's the difference between an extremist on the web who's a quote unquote keyboard warrior, or maybe, provocative, quote unquote, dark web thought leader, or whatever they're calling themselves, and one who might commit violence in real life? Can we identify which is which by their online activity, or is it not that?
Occasionally there's warning signs, but it is very hard to detect single individuals who might be about to commit violence ahead of time, without, to open up the mechanisms where you could do that consistently. I would have some pretty immediate concerns about privacy, digital privacy and surveillance. So it's kind of a tricky situation. But, the way I try to put it to people is, there's kind of influencers in this space. So like the extremist internet circles don't operate really too much differently from anybody, like any other internet circle, right? There are influencers, little like they call them e-celebrities, that in those spaces, they have their own kind of pockets on social media, whether that's on mainstream platforms or on these alternative ones. Like Telegram has gotten really popular for extremism, especially since January 6th. And it's, it has a lot of the same, what you might think of like as the online equivalent of social dynamics to it. So, between that kind of dynamic and then, an individual who might go out and commit violence, I think you can sometimes get a sense that things might go wrong just by kind of observing the community at large and what these influencers are saying and sort of, doing what you're never supposed to do on the internet and reading the comments and getting kind of a temperature reading on, okay, they said this, how do all the people that follow them on this, crazy part of the internet, what do they think of that? And every once in a while you can kind of, it's hard to quantify, but at least I've been doing this long enough. And, as far as this field is concerned, I'm still, fresh, only having done this 6 or 7 years. Just sometimes you just feel it in your gut. And if something like feels wrong or looks wrong, it's the old adage of, if you see something, say something.
Jared, I want to transition from maybe the lone warrior who is a keyboard warrior or a crazy that commits violence in real life, like the Christchurch shooting, which everybody remembers was a horrific shooting. What are the organizational dynamics or the leadership structures in extremist groups? I know all aren't the same, but generally speaking, how organic or grassroots are these communities, or to what degree are they top?
It's it's really mixed, and even within movements themselves. So there are portions of the modern white supremacist movement, for example, that are very top down, very organized, formalized. I think of groups like National Socialist Movement, to the degree that they're a thing these days. That has a very clear command structure. They put out press releases that like 5 people, including myself, read. And like that's very formalized. And then sometimes you have pockets of influencers online. I'm thinking of things like the Boogaloo movement, for example. Before that got sort of blasted off of mainstream platforms and even some alternative platforms because the rhetoric was just so darn violent, to be frank. That is a very kind of decentralized community where maybe there's a few podcast hosts or bloggers in the mix, but how that movement existed online can kind of be understood as just like these giant chat rooms. I was in a few like last year before they booted and moved, and I'm in a few now, but like that is a much more kind of organic and niche thing that was going on. So to kind of not answer your question, but try to answer your question, it varies. The mileage may vary on these things.
No, it's a very broad question. I have another broad question, but you just sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, extremism is a fluid thing in how it presents itself and how it organizes itself. But even if the ideology is old as dirt.
Yeah, so I wanted to hit it. This is a little bit more broad, but take it however you want. With these extremist groups, do they approach notoriety differently? And is there a reason why they do so? So the Proud Boys, you mentioned podcasters. There's certain podcasters that are in these extremist movements. Obviously, they want notoriety. The Proud Boys, they want notoriety. Why do they want notoriety? And then the other groups that don't want notoriety, is there a sinister reason why they're staying behind the scenes? Or is there some nuance to the difference in these two approaches?
So I feel like I keep making this caveat, but I'm approaching these questions with very broad brushstrokes, and there are exceptions to the rule. But As far as the ones that want notoriety, a very common thread that I've seen through the years of doing this work is that whoever it may be, an influencer or a group, etc., they become convinced in themselves that their views and that their actions are more representative of whatever it may be, a left-wing base or a far-right base, than the mainstream or the norm or the establishment, whatever you want to call it. And it's a bit narcissistic, I think, to think like that. But they are pushing for personal notoriety for selfish reasons, like to gain popularity, reputation. Money often flows with those two things, but also for ideological reasons. They almost like a micro politician of sorts. They see themselves as an avatar to carry this ideology further into the mainstream. So it's almost like by promoting themselves or promoting their own pockets online and offline, they're hoping that they can, kind of reshape what the mainstream looks like by having an impact on it. For the groups that don't seek notoriety, that is a little different. Not all of them, it's not an indicator that these groups are actively plotting violence or anything, especially in the wake of January 6th. A lot of these groups, particularly unlawful militia groups, private militia groups, they have really kind of gone back to closed communication. The forum boards and the chat rooms they were using, are kind of blowing tumbleweeds right now, and a lot of them are moving on to email servers and that sort of thing. So, and a lot of that stems from just fear of surveillance, because leaders of agencies like the FBI and DHS have stated explicitly clear that they are looking at these movements. So some of it might, you could maybe interpret just as like a self-preservation thing.
That's very interesting, and I wanted to kind of transition into the impact of mainstream media and then also politicians to give you a little roadmap and the audience a roadmap of where we're going to go with this. But can you tell us the role of mainstream media in amplifying extremist content on the web? There are plenty of examples. We could use Christchurch, or after September 11th, media organizations received criticism for broadcasting bin Laden videos and expanding the terrorist organization's reach. And it happens more and more and more with cable news, and January 6th could be another example of that. Even more concerning is that some of the major media personalities appear openly sympathetic to these attackers. So you have some sympathetic, some that are just amplifying it. What role do you see mainstream media as playing from bringing these extremist conspiracies and extremist hate groups from the dark web, from their email servers, into everybody else's living room who watches these mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, this is just my personal take on this, but my belief is that if you have a large platform, particularly when you start getting into the hundreds of thousands or sometimes millions that like a cable news program might have, there's a moral responsibility to be able to say things are wrong and things are right. There's definitely areas where that's more subjective than others. I don't think necessarily Lester Holt, no relation, should be calling balls and strikes on policy. But when it comes to clear things like, should people break into the halls of Congress running around and trying to prevent an election from being certified? That should be something that is just, Mehdi Hassan of MSNBC put it this way, that people who work in the media should have a bias, and that's towards democracy. And I wholly agree with that. as far as the role it plays with extremism, it's kind of a, unfortunately, it's become in some cases like a back and forth situation. I'm thinking particularly, and everybody picks on Tucker Carlson, but I would say rightfully so, for platforming this stuff. I think it was just last night Tucker Carlson regarded Alex Jones, who's a conspiracy theorist who just lost a set of defamation lawsuits for essentially using his program to, sick conspiracy theorists and defame the parents of Sandy Hook shooting victims. Presented him as a journalist who's like right most of the time or something to that effect. And I think that is just incredibly reckless and dangerous. And I'm kind of amazed Fox hasn't done anything because, I figured there would be like a line somewhere, but there doesn't seem to be one. And that's kind of scary. But, extremist groups will take a lot of their cues from the mainstream media, whether it is to complain about mainstream coverage, to cite mainstream coverage in a distorted way sometimes to justify their own narratives. And for example, here's an example that's recent. In Waukesha, Wisconsin, it was a week or two ago, a man he's not convicted, so I'll say authorities believe have arrested somebody they believe to be responsible for driving a van through a holiday parade, killing several and injuring many others. Just a absolutely horrific event. There was a lot of mainstream news coverage of what was going on. And, some of these far-right groups, once it got around that the suspect that police have now arrested was a black guy, a lot of these white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, et cetera, got really worked up by it. And you had these far-right figures, trying to present like Facebook posts and stuff that of the suspect, like, indicating some support for Black Lives Matter or some, animosity towards white people for whatever reason. And without being able to prove the connection between the crime and those posts, are advancing this narrative that this was some kind of anti-white crime. And this is galvanized, and additionally, like the mainstream media component of this, they were reporting on this. There was all kinds of, criticism that they're calling it a car attack. But until the guys could, until more information is known, that's what you call it, and don't get sued in this case, unlikely event that he's found innocent, in my opinion. But, there hasn't been a whole lot of new information on this case. So of course, reporting slowed down, and it kind of, because that reporting slowed down because outlets are waiting for more information. This individual is facing trial, so he's in and out of courtrooms. The other times he's in jail. They are using this mainstream coverage and the cadence of that mainstream coverage to advance their own narratives about a supposedly anti-white agenda that is underway in this global conspiracy theory that Jewish people are orchestrating with all the cable networks and et cetera, et cetera. So, what happens in the mainstream does affect extremism because they are watching the mainstream and reacting to it and constantly trying to come up with ways to thrust themselves into it. And unfortunately, these days we have some people in the mainstream that have been very clear that they are extending their hands out to those extreme elements and they're willing to pull them in.
On that note, Jared, I'm going to ask you this next question. Having been somebody that I worked for a leader of the Tea Party, and then I worked for the RNC during the 2016 election cycle, I'm now a Democrat. But my question is going into the political for you, Jared. How does the feedback cycle work between political figures and online extremists? There's long been a discussion about whether controversial political leaders or their lawyers or their former national security advisors are influencing their supporters, or just following their lead? It's probably some mixture of both, but in your reporting, what have you seen specifically with January 6th? Was this a top-down rhetoric, or was there some mixture going on?
So specifically in regard to January 6th, I don't think there's really any reasonable question that the people who showed up in Washington on January 6th were there because the president told them to. And they had spent months being fed all kinds of outrageous conspiracy theories about the election being stolen. And that's on the tail of, people in the activism space, particularly the Christian activism, nationalism activism space, regarding Trump as some sort of holy figure, or that, these Supreme Court appointments that Trump was doing were divine appointments. And it created this attitude that, Trump was the righteous ruler of America. It's kind of hard to describe it any other way than that. It was almost like an aspirational monarchy. They believe the whole system's corrupt, but Trump's there to save them. And they thought that was in jeopardy. So, even though Trump didn't get on the mic and say, go to the Capitol and break in through these windows and go XYZ, it's, in my view, kind of impossible to separate the rhetoric of officials like Trump and figures like Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell at the time, etc., from what happened there, because they had extremely large megaphones. They already had the trust of the pro-Trump base, and they used it for something that, in my view, is really despicable, to kind of advance this anti-democratic conspiracy narrative to the masses. And after January 6th, the relationship between elected officials and, what happened has kind of turned on its head. So rather than, pushing these election conspiracy theories, even though there's like some members of Congress who will dodge the question to this day on whether they think Joe Biden was legitimately elected somehow. And it, like I said, it's kind of flipped on its head, and there's been these efforts aided by elected officials like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, to rewrite the history of January 6th, to try to, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of questions about what happened on January 6th, but, using their posts in Congress to advance some of the most, kind of unhinged conspiracy theories about it, like that Antifa or whatever was responsible for it, or that the FBI orchestrated the whole thing. And by bringing that into the halls of Congress, they're, kind of forcing responses to it. They're forcing a certain degree of legitimacy to it. I'm sorry, you can probably hear the squeaky toy that my dog just brought me. Lending that legitimacy really does a lot for this stuff in mainstreaming it, particularly if they can get it to the point where like news networks feel like they have to debunk it or respond to it. It's just that message keeps getting further and further. And it really sucks. I don't know. It's not a good feeling.
But I do want to follow up on Paul Gosar specifically and the others that you mentioned. Again, I mentioned my background because before Gosar kind of went off on the deep end, I did a lot of work with his office on regulatory issues, not social issues, not culture war issues, but environmental issues, energy issues. He was always, a loud voice, but not what we see today. From your perspective, you mentioned revisionist history, you mentioned lying about false flags, which puts our national security at risk. How should we look at this fringe group, the four or five, that's it, members of Congress that you had mentioned, and their actions regarding, and their words regarding January 6th and the aftermath of it? Should we look at them as normal legislators? Should we look at them as something else? Help me understand the paradigm that people should look at them to understand their.
I mean, like you said, Paul Gosar, before he kind of fell off the deep end, was seemingly trying to do some legislating. But when you look at people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or Lauren Boebert, like, what do these people do? They are basically social media influencers, but with like the most exclusive backdrop you can get. And they're just sowing chaos and junking up the gears and, oftentimes advancing things that are really corrosive, especially if you care about, democratic processes and, equality and those sort of things. But, it's also not just them. It is, and at the risk of sounding like I'm both sides in this, it is a almost deafening silence of the other GOP members in Congress, a complete and seemingly total unwillingness to make any of these figures face consequences. And maybe that is because this is what the base wants. They want these like exciting stunts and shenanigans happening in Congress because they hate the whole thing. And also, there hasn't really been like a coherent Democratic response to it. Presumably the other party in Congress that would be there to push back against it, has some strongly worded letters to send. But as far as action, haven't really. Yeah, I mean, I guess there was like the House condemned Paul Gosar for posting that anime video or whatever. But, more broadly, there doesn't seem to be like a coherent idea on how to take this stuff down, in the grand battle of ideas or whatever.
Awesome. So this is going to be my last question. Then we will go to the audience. We will go to Ab and Aram as our first two questioners. So this is very, very controversial, Jared. Not that the last one wasn't. But after the attack on the Capitol, social media companies made sweeping changes to their policy. Trump was banned, so on and so forth. But also, other leaders and groups were banned. This, of course, led to new extremist adaptations, including several leaving the platform altogether, groups using email, groups going offline, as you mentioned in your report, as you mentioned earlier with us. But help me understand this. With in mind that some of these groups went dark and found other corners where they could have their creepy and disgusting and terrorist-like conversations and planning, can we call the new social media policies a success? What do I mean by that? Has the net impact been a dampening effect where their reach has been reduced? Or has the fact that they've gone offline and made these adaptations wiped out any positive from these social media?
And that's sort of the question, right? I think some of it remains to be seen. Like you said, the platforms, the major ones like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., have, especially since January 6th, really tried to keep some of the most obvious extremist elements off of their platforms. A lot of these attempts strike me as incomplete. You don't have to go far on the internet to like find a bunch of really awful, disgusting people, having these kind of conversations. A lot of them in plain sight on platforms that presumably this stuff is banned from. So it's always an enforcement question. Even though that a lot of these groups have been forced kind of offline into more seedier parts of the internet, they have started to regroup a bit, and they're trying to kind of rebuild, back to what they were before January 6th happened and the feds started taking a really close look at them. So it's, I mean, that's an element, right? But as somebody who researches this stuff, because I like the side effects of this stuff are often like violent and targeting like the most vulnerable members of our community, whether that is like members of the Jewish or Muslim faiths, non-white people, etc. They're often the victims of extremist violence and the targets of extremist violence. And, these groups being in the shadows and harder to get to, if that minimizes the threat profile that they are going to cause that kind of harm or be able to cause that kind of harm or recruit, etc., I think that's a net positive. What I worry about, though, is kind of what has happened ideologically in this country, especially over the last 5-6 years. You could probably even rewind the clock further back, depending on how specific you want to get, of this kind of slow ideological shift to the right, and having major outlets like Fox News and et cetera, kind of facilitating that. Encourage, having a vaccine mandate or vaccine/testing mandate in their studios and at their network, and then going on TV every single day and telling their audience not to get the vaccine and stuff because Joe Biden sucks or whatever it is. So like it is kind of weird to be living through that and seeing that when, especially some of the stuff being said about vaccines is like things you would read on like really weird, like crank blogs in 2008 or something, when the blogosphere was still rocking and rolling. But I'm kind of all over the place here because it's not like it's kind of a hard question to answer because extremism is really fluid. It's constantly changing and evolving and like coming up with new schemes and tactics to advance themselves further towards the mainstream and to change the mainstream. And I kind of worry that these shifts that we're seeing, whether it's this like really prominent anti-government sentiments and rhetoric, conspiratorial stuff, the fact that like an individual like Darren Beattie, who left the White House after CNN reported that he spoke at a conference with a bunch of white nationalists, the fact that he's on Fox News like once a week at this point, or like his website Revolver is getting shared around, it's just unconscionable. It's like, how did this happen? So there's these indicators that kind of worry me sometimes about like what's happening ideologically in this country. I don't know if that was a good answer to that question, but like I said, it's a moving target.
Well, it's a First Amendment question, banning people from social media. It's a big question. I'm sure others in the audience will have that. Now, folks, we're going to the meat and potatoes. Jared, you will soon get into the swing of this with the audience. Great audience members here. So 3 rules. 1, wait for your name to be called on. 2, be respectful. Especially, we want to hear from you if you disagree. Keep it in a question form and just be respectful. And then 3, just try and be concise. Keep it to 1 or 2 points so that our guest here can answer, maybe have a little bit of a back and forth. So like we said, it's going to be Ab, Aram, and Eric will be the first 3 questions. So Ab.
Thanks for having me, Justin, John, Peter. Good to see you guys. Jared, it's been a great conversation. So my question for you is, I recognize that there's always been tactics used in the past in order to like eliminate or kind of bring people from extremism kind of like back towards at least more of a moderate, approach to just life in general. But do you see those same tactics working? Like, what have you seen that's been successful in kind of reprogramming people who were very deep in the extremist elements? And is it anything short of actual consequence in being outed, or what exactly?
So, de-radicalization is a space of research in academia. It's kind of been a burning question for a long time, and there's several groups like Life After Hate and groups like that have attempted to make programs for this sort of thing. But intervention experts, especially people, who were former white supremacists, an example, that, are now working in this space. Some of the common threads that I have heard in these discussions, and I'm not a de-radicalization expert, so take it with a grain of salt, but some of the common threads I've seen have been the sooner you can get to somebody, the better. If you can get to somebody before they fall down the rabbit hole, or like while they're on their way to the rabbit hole, that is, you have like just that much more success doing it. Because when they're in these rabbit holes, their whole way of looking at the world changes, and it takes a long time. The second thing to mention time is it takes a while. So because of that commitment, anybody who is trying to take that on has to kind of be ready to sink some time into it. And that kind of leads into, I think, the third thing I would bring up. And if there are any like de-radicalization people on this call, they're probably banging their heads on the table right now because I'm missing so much. But the third thing I would bring up is like to have sort of interventions or these conversations happening with people in their immediate life that they trust, like family members, close friends, pastors, things like, these community figures. It's really, the conditions to allow extremism to exist are a certain degree of social disorder, and the fix to a social problem is kind of a whole of society thing. I'm a bit skeptical of like top-down solutions to this. I think it's just going to have to be collectively, once academics and the people who have really been trying to figure this out for the last, like half a decade, once they finally are, get their research past the point of, being able to go into journals and publication and stuff. Hopefully that will provide tools for people to feel confident in stepping in and hopefully stopping people from falling down a rabbit hole.
Thank you for that question and answer. We will go to Aram and then Eric Weinstein. Aram.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jared, for being here. Love your work and really excited to hear from you. So I'm a student of movements, and just as a very basic rule, you destroy a centralized system by chopping off its head. You take down a decentralized system by injecting it with a value that fundamentally changes that network. And I think in a lot of ways, the kind of misinformation machine on the far right that led to January 6th and lots of other things really is a fairly decentralized network, even though it has a lot of coordination within it. And one of the things to me that appears to be a weakness, and I'm curious what you think about this, is this cry for election integrity. Because if they were to actually if folks actually understood what election integrity meant, you might see a shift from sort of the nefarious hidden agenda that underlies the lies, and actually could be shifted towards people working towards what actual election integrity would look like. Things like, having paper ballots for every vote that's cast that are readable by humans, and risk limiting audits, and a number of other things. And I'm just curious if you think that these networks could be infiltrated with that kind of messaging, where something like a real election integrity could kind of bring people back into the mainstream and off the ledge. I'm just curious what you think about that. Thanks so much.
I think, infiltration of these spaces, especially the media spaces that inform these communities, is pretty tough. It's probably not impossible, but I imagine it would be pretty hard. There's a big disposition. They sort of, through repeating over and over again, like kind of train their audience to distrust everything beyond the immediate confines of their ideological circle. And to just write it off, it's like that was the utility of the word or the phrase fake news, right? It was some counter information. Well, that's just fake news. You don't have to even think about that. So I think it would be tough. But it's like elections are pretty secure. I mean, like there are already like integrity measures built into the election system. And of course there's areas where that could probably be made even stronger. But maybe I'm a cynic or something at this point, but I'm a bit skeptical of the ability to really bust into like some of these harder conspiratorial networks.
Thank you for that answer and question. We will go to Eric Weinstein, and then we will go to Jim. Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. I'm very concerned about right-wing extremism in particular, but I have to say that the thing that I don't understand is I view that the left, which I have traditionally considered myself a part of, although I'm not quite sure where I am anymore, has been creating the sort of pressures, a system of selective pressures that is selecting for right-wing extremism simply by very obvious consistency checks. So, for example, when there's a killing of many people and somebody says the apparent perpetrator shouted a religious saying in a foreign language, almost everyone substitutes Allahu Akbar in that situation because we've effectively disguised it in the most dumb fashion possible as like connect the dots with two dots or something like that. Now, it doesn't have to be Allahu Akbar, but it's very clear to most of us that when there is a jihadist or Islamic terror incident, the language changes to extremism, not particularly tied to anything. There's a suspension of interest in a motive. And in general, my Muslim friends find this bewildering because they consider that there is a problem with Islam and terror, and that there's no point in disguising it. I think in many ways, the discussion that you had of the Wisconsin situation, many people believed that if there was even a whiff of black people being killed by a white motorist in the same circumstance, there might be a leap to a suspicion of white supremacy or anti-Asian hate if Asians were harmed. And I think the thing that I don't understand about your project in some sense is that the easy win here is to stop trying to do social engineering and just actually report the news. Either have a policy that motives will never be discussed or have a policy that all motives will be discussed. But the idea of, in some sense, treating the news differently as to whether it goes narrative or counter-narrative, and in particular something about January 6th, if you think about the Time magazine article that talked about fortifying democracy, and in fact there was a conspiracy of sorts and Trump was actually right. These are the sorts of things that produce low trust. So I think that what my question would be, assume that we have the value that we want a democratic society that's pluralistic, welcoming of all people, faiths, colors, creeds, etc. Why do we not see the possibility that the real problem is that established media is engaging in transparent social engineering, creating a low-trust environment, which is then filled by extremist entrepreneurs selling some sort of willingness to talk about what no one seems to want to talk about, such as leaping to a white supremacy conclusion for some killings and disguising apparent motives in the case of others? Thanks very much.
That's a really interesting question. I think it's a bit hypothetical, so it's hard for me to answer. I mean, I definitely think that generally, particularly cable news, has just become like very sensationalized, and sometimes it can feel like you're watching ESPN rather than a serious news program if you're watching these 24-hour loops. And the social engineering argument, I think, goes both ways. You could look at an institution like Fox News or like a widely read newspaper like New York Post, peddling anti-vaccine things and, kind of make the same argument. I think the way out of this is to be more intentional about advocating for, clear values in news and clear ethics in news. And, going forward with that and rewarding that. And I like the sensationalism stuff. I just don't know how sustainable it is long term. Because we saw the pivot to video, like crash and burn, right? Like this, really trying to appeal to these online audiences. And of course, what's popular in the online audience is what reconfirms a bias, et cetera. I think maybe there should be like kind of a rethinking of like how to sell the news. And I think maybe that would influence some editorial decisions. But it's, personally, I'm not huge on any, and I don't know if this is exactly what you were getting at, Eric. Justin, maybe if we could have Eric come back just to make sure that I'm not, misrepresenting you.
Sure.
But I'm not really like a huge fan of the, suggestions that, for example, right-wing extremism is like a reaction to left-wing mainstream, because these forces have always been toiling in society. Like there's always been conspiracy theorists, there's always been anti-Semitism, white supremacist groups, etc. The question that, you have to wonder is like, why is this popular now?
Yeah, I think I'm getting super confused. In my case, I'm a guy who voted for Bernie. I've never voted Republican. I've got an obviously identifiable Jewish last name. Finding myself in print as a far-right voice, which doesn't need to be explained, if only because, let's say, I work for Peter Thiel, or I am furious about the left, which controls most of the really important media properties and news, though not all. In general, if I want to call out our own problem with inconsistency, so for example, if somebody had recorded under Math Boy Fly anti-black videos from a white perspective, I have no question that those would have been all over the media. But it's very clear that it wouldn't be the case in reverse. And so I find that I'm spending almost all of my time bailing water, trying to say that people on the left, people who are educated, don't necessarily look down on everybody in the middle of the country. We can see the problem with the media properties, that there's obviously a naked bias to do some sort of social correction before we ever get to the facts. And that my purpose in this is in part de-radicalization by saying, no, you can see something is actually wrong with, discussion of the vaccines. You can see something wrong with the discussion of killings or hate groups or whatever. But that doesn't mean you should immediately lurch, towards David Duke because he's willing to reify your reality. I can see the same problem that you're seeing. I'm clearly not a right-wing figure. And yet, the weird thing is that any deviation from the script is almost reflexively treated as if it was a particular form of right-wing extremism. Just saying that the courthouse in Portland was firebombed repeatedly by Antifa on a nightly basis. I'm watching video of it, and people are claiming that Antifa doesn't exist at the same time, that it's more of an idea. I would put to you the question is, I am seeing consistent gaslighting almost every time a story like this is reported. And it's got a bias in a direction that I'm not familiar with. I've always thought NPR, New York Times, et cetera, have some sort of bias, but it's never been remotely like this. And to hear, in some sense, the tote bag crowd from NPR, to me at the moment, it's like they haven't noticed that the character of the news and the extent to which this new belief structure has suffused all analysis of simple data. it's very clear that we don't have a uniform policy, for example, about white nationalism and black nationalism or Islamic extremism as to how it's reported. And I guess I put the question to you, is it not blatantly obvious that those of us who previously considered ourselves sort of center-left establishment types feeling like we had a functional country have, in some sense, gone down a new path with a lot of the sort of social engineering, which is causing a vacuum that's being filled by particularly far-right extremist entrepreneurs. I think I hear in your voice that you don't see a consistent problem with our news that's sort of suffused through everything.
So is my mic on? Yeah. Okay. So I think what you're getting at is something I agree with. But first, like the situation in Waukesha, I think the reason that specifically looks so different is because the police came out very quickly and said they didn't believe it was terrorism. So terrorism legally being defined as an act of violence, et cetera, intended to produce political impact or result. But to the broader point of what you're saying, I do think that there are kind of harsh realities that have to be reckoned with and faced to get to the other side of this social disorder that we're facing as a country right now. And as trust in institutions decline, et cetera, as trust in these institutions decline, I think there's some really uncomfortable things that these institutions have to ask themselves and reckon with on why that trust is declining. And it's going to take some, a long, hard look in the mirror and a dash of creativity to make up for the lost ground. And it's probably going to be a long project. But I think it's important that, those kind of problems are discussed in kind of, what's the cliche? Like, trying to make sure that the cooler heads prevail and push the cooler heads, further into the discourse and that sort of thing. It could go a long way. Eric, I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it got close.
I hope to discuss it with you on other forums, and let's hear from some other voices. Thanks very much for taking.
Thank you for asking your questions. We are going to go to Cami, and then we will go to Nikki. Cami, sorry for putting you on the spot like that.
Thank you, Justin, for hosting this wonderful conversation. Jared, my question to you is, what are your thoughts if you could affect change in one area, what would it be and why?
Just broadly across politics?
In any area, knowing what you know and based upon your analysis of what happened on January 6th and the aftermath, and where you see social media heading towards the future, what would that be?
It's the puzzle nobody's totally cracked yet, but some sort of regulation on social media companies I think is a bit overdue. What exactly that looks like, you have to be so careful in writing it as to not just like overstep boundaries that government shouldn't be overstepping as far as speech goes and that sort of thing. But I think these companies, a lot of them are designed with really kind of perverse incentives, right? Ultimately, we are the product of these companies, and they make their money by selling our attention, and everything down to like the color of notifications that pop up on the apps to what the apps are showing you and what is being amplified is all, oftentimes algorithmically done to try to keep you on the site. And like anger and outrage is a really great way to keep somebody on a site. So I think, I am not a policy guy, so I don't know what that looks like, but I definitely think that there's got to be some accountability for these major social platforms, because it's really just like the Wild West out there, and a lot of these have gotten so big that it's like almost impossible for a company to like legitimately compete with one of these platforms at any sort of scale.
Yeah, we had arguably the conservative most member of Congress on the show, Ken Buck, to discuss this exact issue, and he maybe doesn't agree. Well, actually, he does, I think now agrees with some type of reform of Section 230 and algorithms, but he is big on breaking up big tech as a starter, just to kind of decentralize their power a little bit and move us forward in that way. And he is, one of the 5 or 10 most conservative members in all of the House and Senate. And he's also a senior position in the House Judiciary Committee dealing with the Antitrust Subcommittee. So we will go to Nikki, and then we will go to Rachel. So Nikki.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate you being on, Jared. I'm also a researcher in domestic terrorism. I'm based out of the Pacific Northwest, so I've kind of been following sort of what's been going on with Proud Boys and Antifa. And my question was to you is like, this is a little bit of a complex question, but J6 wasn't just one particular small coalition of people, right? We saw everybody from Book Boys to white supremacists to Proud Boys to mom and pops, and in the last couple of months we saw their reach kind of expand outwards, because their issue is not just, these people are just not just concerned about election rights. They're also thinking about school board issues. And that brings me to the point of the FBI kind of developing terrorist networks, because we saw that a lot of people at J6 weren't just, typical disgruntled white guys, but they were also, school moms there. And so I guess my question to you is where do you see these networks, how do you see these networks developing, and like what issues do you see them gravitating towards it, and how do you see the threat of the Omicron variant in conjunction with the midterm election kind of moving and changing these groups?
Oh man, that's a lot of questions rolled up into one.
I'm so sorry.
I'll give it a shot.
I think that's the second time that's happened tonight.
I'll give it the good, honest college try, as they say. As far as the network goes, one figure that's been really interesting to me, looking at, George Washington University and their program on extremism, has been keeping like a spreadsheet, essentially, of everybody who's been arrested for the Capitol riot. And of the people on that spreadsheet, it's really only like, I think like a fifth to a quarter of the people that actually have been charged for the Capitol riot belong to known extremist groups, which I think kind of raises the question of like, what about the other 80% or 70%? I forget the exact number right now. I hope you'll forgive me, but and I think that's kind of where the question of like a network effect comes in. Of, these aren't, people who went out and joined the Proud Boys, but they shared enough common beliefs that they followed them into the building. And that's a bit of a harder thing to push back on. A lot of the networks that drive misinformation, particularly the ones that were some of the most prolific drivers of misinformation after the 2020 election on the right, are very incestuous, and they are able to build themselves up and gain these large audiences through constant cross promotion, running defense for each other, and really creating this like very tight and limited, almost like isolation chamber, where I mentioned the term like fake news being deployed on a national scale in this respect, but kind of isolating people from any information that might contradict the beliefs being espoused to them. And these networks, operate and make their money, etc., by really trying to stoke outrage and fear, and because that gets people clicking, and it's not unique to their media space. That happens all over, right? When there's scary stuff on the news, people tune in. There's like a very cynical cliche in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. It's just unfortunate reality, but I think the isolation of these networks and kind of the outrage and fear that they foment kind of postures them in a way where they can almost kind of guide it towards things as they feel the desire to advance whatever narrative or whatever agenda item they're deciding to rally behind. And it's not a really formally coordinated network. I think it's you can almost think of the dynamics in the same way as like a team. It's a lot of these people are not coordinating in shadowy layers. It's just like big Twitter DM rooms, for example. So I try to get to I think most of what I heard in that question. Did I get close, Nikki?
Yes. Yeah, you
Okay.
got pretty close. Yeah. I kind of rambled because I was just sort of excited to talk about school board politics and kind of like watching these networks grow. So that was a pretty solid answer, given that I just threw like 9 questions at you.
Well, it's okay. I was rambling a bit too, because as I'm talking, I'm trying to remember, okay, what else did Nikki say, etc. But we gave it a shot.
No, this was great. Great question, Nikki. I think this is your first time in the room, so we appreciate that. So on that note, we're going to go to one more question, then I'm going to shoot it over to Jared for last thoughts. We are going to go, I believe I said Rachel is up. So over to you, Rachel.
Great. Thanks so much, Justin. So, Jared, before I ask the question, my question to you, I want to just express my concern about the way Eric framed the severity of white supremacist violence within this nation, because I think that is a widespread and pervasive issue, and it historically has been. And to dismiss that and act as though this is a leftist, reactionary point or something that's just meant to drive or sensationalize to draw news viewership, that's deeply concerning to me. But my question for you is about when you talked about the January 6 folks, and you were saying how they are not all officially considered to be a part of these various extremist groups. Do you think that's because they're white? Like, do you think the same thing would be happening right now if it was a, group of minorities who had stormed the Capitol and behaved in the way that those folks did, defecating, smearing it on the walls, destroying property, etc.? Do you think that we would be looking at this the same way? And do you think that has shaped the response of the police and these social media networks?
Yeah, appreciate you saying that thing off the top that was more eloquent. I was a little kind of scratching my head there at sort of the framing of Eric's question, and maybe I'll follow up with him at some point and see what he meant there. But when you say like the same thing happening, can you elaborate what you mean by the same thing? And then I'll try to give the answer a go.
So I was only 4 when 9/11 happened, but I remember how every single Middle Eastern looking person was then stopped, whether we be at the airport or wherever it was, and assumed they were a terrorist. But when we see the things that happened on January 6th, especially because a lot of these folks are on the app and talk about how they were there or they went in or whatever else, we don't see that consistent level of, criminalization or the acknowledgement that these folks committed a crime and treason. Like, do you and and just the way that the judicial system has responded with the judges saying, oh, yeah, you can go to Mexico for your vacation, or we're going to, answer these prisoners' demands for XYZ. Do you think that things just haven't been taken as seriously because of who this group of extremists are? Do you think that shapes the way that the police and social media corporations have responded to what occurred?
Yes, is the short answer. Some additional factors I think that play in was the fact that these extreme views were often echoed and blasted out by President Trump, and these companies in their timidness or whatever it may be were afraid of angering an entire electorate and jeopardizing their company financially, which is very cynical and another great reason why these companies, in my opinion, should be held to more accountability. But so in the lead up to January 6th, I saw all these groups talking, and maybe I was naive, and, they were discussing their intentions, and a few groups were really intentional about saying, yep, we're going to the Capitol. And other people were like, man, I really hope we go into the Capitol and do X, Y, Z. And I was just bewildered at the police response and how they're just, or I guess the lack of a police response would be the right way to put it. It is very hard, to justify that when in California you have, police officers chasing down the Antifa vans, or like you said, after 9/11, another major incident, just this complete activation of the national security state to surveil and you had media working in with it, advancing these terrible anti-Muslim stereotypes. But yeah, the short answer is yes. This would not be playing out the way it's playing out if so many of the suspects were not white conservatives.
Before we go, I do want to give you a last question here. What do you want to leave the audience with, whether it be positive, negative, or some?
Yeah, I guess the optimistic take I have is that, even though January 6th was one of the most blatant and naked attacks on democracy that we've seen in a generation, ultimately it failed. And I think that it's a small amount of comfort, but a little amount of comfort is there. And if people can organize and unite under this sense of moral clarity, I definitely think it is possible to push back on this stuff and defeat this stuff. It's just, there has to be a unified push and a unified voice against it. I also think, social media companies, it seems like regulation is becoming this bipartisan desire. So maybe they will get regulated. We just have to hope and pray it's in a smart way. So all of that is to say, I believe change is possible. It takes a lot of work to get there, but we're in a very strange moment in our country right now. And if there was ever a time to put in the work, it's right now.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Jared for coming out, to our audience for their questions, to Eric Weinstein for dropping by, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.